Hi, today is the last day of the year, and I wanted to share some lessons that I learned in the year that wanted, I believe would be very instrumental in my 2026. Most of them are simple ideas, and I mean, might probably help someone out there as well. So, the first one I want to talk about is effect horizons. So, the concept of effect horizon is how some things start out easy, some things start out, you know, the cost of doing them, it's really low. I mean, there are actually things you want to do. You feel maybe tempted is the word, things you want to do, but then you find out that when you think about it in the long term, the pain it's going to cost you. I made a video earlier about it, the fact that someone who wants to be a bodybuilder, for example, or generally someone who wants to live a healthy life, you have to go to the gym, you have to be fit. But if you wanted to live a healthy life and then you're eating junks, you find that you're not going to be healthy. In the long term, you're going to have worse health. But in the immediate, when you eat sugary foods, when you eat, because usually unhealthy food is usually sweet. So you get to, enjoy, derive pleasure in the moment, but in the long term, it works, against you, and that's something that a lot of times it's made me, I really just think about it. Maybe you want to do something, consider how is this going to pan out in the long term? Is this something that would help me in the long term, or this is something that I would regret doing in the long term? Of course, I'm not perfect, and I'm not saying I now make excellent decisions every time, but I think just having that framework in mind helps you such that, you know, awareness makes you, so if you're aware of something, you're more likely to do it. So now I'm more likely to do things that may not be fun in the moment, but will give me a better result over the long term. Another concept that I also learned, the second concept I want to talk about would be, you know, three basic stuff that really help balance your health and all of that. You see, a lot of times we try to do the big things when it comes to doing certain things. We want to do the big things. We want to, um, you know, for those who are really into health, you want to buy supplements, you want to, figure out, blue light therapy, all of those fanciful stuff. But then some of the biggest changes, some of the things that would affect your life the most are doing the basic things. Let's, for example, now if we're talking about your health, you'll be very much healthier if you just eat good food, you sleep properly, and then you do, basic exercises. You would have a far much better life than if you were trying to, buy, whatever may be the trending supplements now. So that's an idea that some of the biggest changes in our lives are going to be occasioned by, small, often the things we want to ignore. When you talk about someone who wants to live healthy, someone can be telling you they want to live healthy, but the same person goes to bed by 1 a.m., by 2 a.m. And it's like, how does that even make sense? Someone wants to, be healthy and full of energy, but then they don't take their diet seriously. It's not even about taking it seriously, but, you know, eating stuff that is going to be good for your body, and not intentionally wrecking your, body's chemistry by taking in lots of sugars and the likes, especially processed sugars. So now that's the second idea that has really, I learned that in this December, and it's something that I want to take to the next year, and it's something I want to, give more time. It's something I want to apply more. I want to make sure that I eat healthier because I'm a person who likes junk food a lot. And usually what used to be my justification was that it's easier to make, you just get bread and then maybe you get bottle of soda and then you're good. I mean, you don't need to go to the kitchen to spend hours. But something I've learned is you're not really saving time because by the time you take that bread and that soda, it messes up your body's chemistry. So while even if you wanted to work and then maybe you you went to your desk and then you wanted to do work, you would not be able to, especially if you do creative work, because your mind is going to be, hyper s- sensitive. Like you're going to be like, really anxious for nothing, right? Your body's going to be, really just, it wouldn't be balanced, it wouldn't be stable because of the surge of the sugar you get from most of these foods. So that is something that going into the year 2026, I want to be more intentional about, if cook the food. Yeah, it may take an hour, of course, because, and that's when you cannot afford to outsource that. If you cannot afford to outsource your cooking, make the food yourself. It might take an hour, it might take about 30 minutes, it might take 2 hours. But especially when you cook something that is going to last more than a day or so, it doesn't really matter, because when you eat healthy, you're able to, your body's chemistry is, great. And that you really do not have to, your, your mind is not messed up. So that's the idea. The third thing I learned that I really would like to share is the concept of long term thinking. Now, of course, this is not really a new idea. This is something everybody has probably heard about, but I've really been thinking about things from a long term perspective, or trying to look at what it would mean to look at things from a long term perspective. For example, if you were working on something, you find that there's hardly anything you want to work on today that if you decided that I want to give this 10 years, a lot of times when we see someone tried something and failed, it's because it just did not give it enough time. So a lot of, you find that most things are achievable if you would just look at them with the correct, you know, mind frame, with the correct time frame. So, for example, you wanted to build a company or something, you can look at it now. I'm just starting. I have just this small company, and then it's like there's this big established, you know, person in the market. But then if you reframe what you're doing to say, okay, I want to build this company over 10 years, you realize that it wouldn't really matter the size you are now, because 10 years is a long time for you to be able to, you know, have at least started making a dent in the market. So if you think just maybe in short term, you find that a lot of things will not be worth doing. But then the opportunities in the long term, because if you think of it in the long term, this, I want to be able to do this over 10 years, over 20 years, you find that a lot more things are achievable. The fourth thing that I learned this year that I'd like to share is a concept called the journeys of contradiction. How, you know, sometimes the greats are not just good at one thing, but it's like they are good at things that are like opposite. For example, I think the video I watched that really grounded this for me, one of the examples the creator gave was someone like Michael Jordan. All right. So a lot of times basketballers, used to be either an attacker or a defender. I think that's really common in sports, even in football. You see someone is either an attacker or a defender. But one of the things that gave Michael Jordan his advantage that made him like the GOAT in basketball was the fact that he wasn't just an attacker, he was a defender as well. So he could play those seeming contradictory, you know, positions, and it made him a generally greater basketballer. You find, and that is something that you see even in other fields. You see some of the people who are able to, make step changes, really do things that are amazing, are people who do not just accept, when people say, no, you're only supposed to, maybe for example, you like um your business person, or maybe you're into marketing, let me put it that way. There's this assumption that you should not be good with numbers in a way, or you cannot be both creative and be, you know analytical. It doesn't have to be. I mean, that could be the reality for most people, but nothing says you cannot. So you can still go. If that is what you want to do, if that is the part you're called to, if that is what you have, so do not, don't say, everybody who is creative doesn't do this. So you now, because of that, don't do things that you can't do. You know, if everybody who's a defender is not an attacker, and then you feel you can be an attacker, don't now say, no, I mean, an attacker is an attacker, a defender is a defender. Be who you need to be. A lot of times it's in being that person that, you're able to, achieve success. Finally, the other concept that I learned this year that I really think is really interesting is the concept of, you know, second order effect. Now, a lot of times you find that when you do something, there's what happens in the immediate, but there's what you've done causes to happen. An example that I watched in a video that I thought was really interesting was how, the creator gave an example of how there was this pharmaceutical company. Now, if you understand the way pharmaceutical companies work, a lot of time is spent in the lab researching drugs that never eventually make it, right? Stuff that never eventually becomes drugs that people can use. But you see, that process is necessary to having breakthrough drugs. If you do not experiment, if you don't, you need those failures to be able to get successes. But then there was an investor, that's what we're calling, who looked at, he was just looking at, for example, businesses through the lens of finances. And then when he looked at it, of course, like a balance sheet, and then he saw that, okay, this part of the business was taking, that's the labs and the pharmaceuticals, was taking a chunk of the revenue. And it was a lot of hits and misses because, many times you do that stuff and you don't really get, the efficiency is poor. Many of the experiments never become drugs. And then when you looked at it, it was like this part of the business is taking away so much. So his idea was to cut off that part of the business. So what he did was he bought that business and then locked off the laboratory. He cut up the laboratory because they already had a number of successful drugs that they were selling, which, were bringing in the profits. And then the lab, at least at that time, wasn't really bringing in any. It was probably a season where they were just, making experiments and did not really have a breakthrough at the moment. But you see, now he cut off that laboratory, and then what happens was profits surged because they were no longer spending, you know in drug research and all of that. But now what he didn't consider was the second order consequence. Now in the immediate, of course, it's going to bring profit because you're no longer spending on research and development. But in the long term, when you no longer have a research department, what happens? You no longer have new drugs. And that was how they were steamrolled. They were, made profit in the short term, but in the long term, they couldn't compete with other labs that were, improving drugs and then bringing new drugs to the market. So sometimes, in that case, having that lab look like an inefficiency and something that was to be cut off. But when you look at it in the long term, when you think of the second and maybe third and even fourth, other consequences, you find that that's a stupid decision. Cutting up the lab was a stupid decision because without the lab, you don't have, a pharmaceutical company. And of course, we can also you know, look at our lives through this lens. There are some things that you do now that, maybe you want to cut them off, but before you cut them off, maybe they look as inefficiencies. What would cutting this off mean? What would cutting this off mean? And now, the idea here is not that you don't cut things off, but is that you consider what would this mean. Look at things like from, almost as though you're extracting yourself from the situation and then looking at it from a third person. What would, if I were to cut off this stuff, what would that mean? Now, sometimes it actually is for the good. Let's say, for example, you have maybe a friend who, takes you to places you don't want to go. Sometimes, if you're able to cut off, you find that that's actually a good decision. Number one, that you cut them off. Or first, cutting them off might not feel great, but then you realize that by cutting them off, you now have time to do the things that are important to you. You now have time to, free time. Let's say you had this friend who every time you always go partying and then, really just get wasted and all of that, hangovers and all of that. But you see, by, doing what is not pleasant, which is cutting them off, you find that you don't have time to do the things that are important to you. Maybe you wanted to build a business, but they were always trying to, take you out and all of that. You find that by doing something unpleasant, the second other consequence is something that is pleasant. And then sometimes by doing things that feel pleasant or seem like the good decision, back to our investor, by trying to make more profits in the short term, you're setting up the future to be, you know, terrible. So those are, maybe that's 5 ideas or 4 ideas. Can't really remember the number now, that I learned this year, that, you know, I just would have at the back of my mind going into 2026. And yes, we'll see how that goes. Thank you so much for watching this video. God bless you.